Good evening to one and all present here. Thank you for investing your Wednesday with us and joining us for a very interesting session on a topic which involves not just students who are preparing for law, but also students who have already been law. We received a lot of emails about this topic, and students were very happy that someone at least is going to come and guide us on this very topic, which is very integral part of even preparation, even before one decides about law. So we keep on taking webinars and school seminars where we go and tell them that okay, a law student needs to be a very voracious reader. You should be reading because it helps them in improving their English, their grammar, and their vocab, and so many other things. So this was one topic which I had in my mind from long, and I have to say this thing that this topic came into my mind after meeting my dear colleague and faculty at law school, Chinmay, Professor Chinmay, who has a great collection of books. We all are very, very envious of. We look at his collection and we're like, wow. And that's how, we lawyers are also. So if you visit lawyer's chamber also, you'll see a collection of books there. But it is a fact that, it helps us a lot. And that's exactly from where we chose this topic. And we were very clear that that's exactly how the webinar series for this year should start. So before I move further, I also need to introduce Professor Chinmay. Professor Chinmay is one of, a classic blend between National Law School education from India and also, his LLM from abroad. Someone who has great experience of interacting with students from all over the world and now in India. And inside the campus also, I've seen him, where students are holding him to such high regard. And he had a very busy day today. He was training students for moot court, but then he was very clear that this is one of those topics which I want to take, and I 100% make sure that I come and discuss with the students. So here he is. So let me start with the first thing, because there are things which I may also not know. And let's start with a small introduction about you, and where you can also throw light on your academic journey, as in the things you have done, and also encourage our youngsters and also those students who are currently pursuing law about how to go about it. Yes, Tim.
First of all, thank you very much for that very kind introduction, Deepu. But you're right. I mean, this is one topic that is very close to me, and we've discussed it a couple of times. But when it comes to books and encouraging someone, suggesting books to someone, I'm all for it. So it was never, I never had second doubts about, doing this. Now, in terms of my journey, I did my undergrad from NLU Jodhpur. I graduated in 15, and then I did, as you said, my master's from Frankfurt, where I focused on legal philosophy, jurisprudence. After my master's, I came back and I worked at Nalsar University in Hyderabad for around 4 years, while also kind of finishing my PhD, which I continued to do from the Frankfurt University. And in all these years, I've taught multiple courses, including traditional courses such as law of torts or administrative law or jurisprudence, and also elective courses which revolved around my own area of interest and expertise, which is essentially law and philosophy and topics that revolve around that. So that's really the crux of, I think, my experience and my interest areas. In terms of my research, my PhD topic, I worked on comparing two legal philosophers, Friedrich Hayek and Jürgen Habermas, and trying to think about how legal theories by these two thinkers can help us visualize how blockchain can be governed, given that it's international and given that there are no prior rules or national laws that can be applied there. So that also focused on the idea of legal philosophy.
Excellent, excellent. Okay, so now let's get on with the business and why the students are here. Now I went through the list which you had sent for students, so which we'll be sharing with the students also. But something which struck me is that your list includes books from various genres and disciplines. Why is it important for law students to have a diverse reading list that goes beyond just the textbooks that they read for, say, CRPC, CPC, IPC, or anything else? Why should they read so many genres and disciplines?
Well, I mean, that's a great question. First of all, I haven't included any textbooks in here. I mean, there are books that are related to constitutional law. There are books that are related to jurisprudence. But my understanding is you will be studying some of the basic concepts in your law school, in your journey in any way. The point is to focus on, let's say, the broader context, something that can help understand you those subjects that you'll be studying in law school in a much more holistic and a well-rounded manner. Um, so one of my colleagues just gave me an example. She said, you can never focus on one country to understand how global politics works. You'll have to kind of look at the global map altogether, right? So if you simply choose to focus on, let's say, CPC in isolation, you will not be able to understand why was CPC enacted in 19th century. Or let's take the example of criminal laws and amendments in criminal laws that are recently introduced with the notion of decolonization of law. Now, if you read the amended act, you'll only be able to kind of get maybe the superficial idea of what that law is and what the provisions say. But if
Right.
you really want to understand why these amendments are introduced, how they might be interpreted, how they are applied, how the practical aspect of it works, you will not be able to understand it if you don't know the historical context of it, if you don't know the political circumstances of it, if you don't know, the broader discourses that are happening around it. And that's precisely why I think a good lawyer or even a good judge, a good legal professional needs to have that well-rounded perspective. He cannot simply focus on, let's say, one branch of law. I mean, law itself is a very wide field, and it's impossible to perhaps, be master in one area of law. But what helps, and the most interesting perspectives are always interdisciplinary perspectives. The most insightful perspectives can only be based on these multiple lenses that one is exposed to, and that's why I've chosen not only, let's say, books that are related to law or legal professionals, but also books that can help you have that kind of well-rounded perspective, that can help you widen your horizons and can give you that insight, which includes history or philosophy or even fictional works that can give you that sense of empathy that helps in kind of widening of the horizons.
Very true. In fact, and you were, your fellow faculty was also very right when she said that. And specifically, I remember that law was the first ever, I think the integrated course was the first ever interdisciplinary,
Yeah,
course
yeah,
introduced.
yeah, you're right. I mean,
Yes.
precisely why we have either BA LLB or BBA LLB. I
Yeah,
mean, it
yeah.
was possible to simply have a professional LLB degree,
And
but
that's why they don't require anything as such, where I get students that, okay, which subject should I take after 10th to
mm,
do?
mm,
You can do anything because,
absolutely,
when you step
absolutely,
into law school, everything starts from the scratch and it's all interdisciplinary. Where a student, I was a commerce student, where I could also go to a law school and learn philosophy and
yeah,
that's how it goes. Great. So when I talk about philosophy, that's exactly from where my
mm,
second question would come. I read the list where one of those books where the story of philosophy by Will Durant
right,
and philosophy by the Sarvapalli Radhakrishnan.
yeah,
In whose memory we celebrate the Teachers' Day.
yeah,
Uh, how can philosophy and both Western and Indian shape a law student's perspective and critical thinking? So this is like a very important
right,
thing.
right,
They
right,
both of these things, though you answered, I want you to dig deeper and go
yeah,
and explain that how when Western and Indian philosophies together would be, read out, what should the student be doing and how the student will develop that critical thinking, plus also retain the core values of all these,
right,
both.
right, right. Well, I mean, first of all, let me kind of, preface this with a general disclaimer that, the list that I've suggested is my perspective is, out of hundreds and thousands of books that are available, it was a very difficult task to come up with, let's say, these 20 books that, I've broadly identified. And it reflects my own experiences, my inclinations, and my biases also, perhaps. So this is not the only list. There are multiple lists that are available, but this is based on what I would like a law student to ideally have to develop that well-rounded perspective. And it's from that perspective. And of course, any suggestions, any additions, any changes to this list are also always welcome. Having said that, why I started with philosophy is because it's something that is known as the mother discipline of all other disciplines. It's something that gives you that meta perspective, right? That broader perspective. It allows you to take a step back in life. You're always engaged in it, right? You're studying law, you're studying different things, you're engaged in life. What philosophy does, as Will Durant calls it, I have most of the books here, so I'll be able to kind of at least show you the copies that I have here.
Yes, collection.
Uh,
Yeah.
so what Will Durant says is that, what philosophy does is it allows you to kind of take that pause and think about why we are doing what we are doing.
Hmm.
And that insight which you can gain from this idea of self-reflection, that self-awareness that comes from it, that really helps organize things mentally in your kind of world. When you start making sense of, when you start understanding the motivations, the rationale behind, why are we studying law, perhaps, what it
Hmm.
is that law offers in the first place.
True.
Not only my motivation to study law, but what it is that law tries to do in the first place.
Hmm.
Now, all of this is ultimately connected to, let's say, human nature.
Hmm.
In a society, all of us are essentially trying to live together. We know that there will be inevitable conflicts, but we are trying to figure out a way in which these conflicts can be minimized and can be adjudicated in a more structured way.
Very true.
Now, when we do that, there are also naturally questions that are raised about human nature, right? Why do we have these conflicts? Is it possible to maybe resolve these conflicts through different ways? How is our legal system structured? What are the assumptions behind these legal systems? And when we ask these questions, that's when we start to think critically. And you must have noticed our judges and our lawmakers, our jurists, they've all started to think about the idea of decolonizing the legal system, right?
Yeah.
They say that India needs to think independently now. We need
Hmm.
to think about our own systems.
Yeah.
And when we are doing that, we also need to understand what are the first principles, what are some of the basic ideas on the basis of which this entire framework is constructed.
Hmm.
And I think philosophy provides a great way of understanding that
True.
because it focuses on the idea of human nature. It focuses on the idea of morality. What are the sources of morality? What is the goal of morality? Um, what are the alternative political systems that are available, right?
Hmm.
When we think about political philosophy. So for instance, in this book, he starts with the prime philosopher in Western philosophy, Plato. And the same questions which Plato asked around 2,500 years back, we are still asking the same questions.
True.
We are still kind of debating the same issues. He also suggested certain ideas about how society should be organized. Today, we are still discussing the same ideas about how society should ideally be organized. He provided certain interesting insights that were debated by, let's say, the next philosopher, Aristotle. Today,
Hmm.
you have multiple perspectives on the same issue.
True.
So, these questions have never stopped. Being human means being curious, and being curious means that you are not alone in your inquiry. There
Hmm.
are thinkers who have thought about the same things, and through their experiences, they've given some interesting insights, some interesting answers. So we are not alone in our inquiry. We can kind of, these are our friends. So I look
Hmm.
at it as, these are my friends, and
Yes.
I ask them, tell me your perspectives, tell me your experiences. What do you think about human nature? What do you think about the notion of morality? And whatever their suggestions are, they enrich my life. They enrich my perspective. And I think Will Durant has put it in such a great narrative format. He doesn't make, philosophy typically is considered as a bit boring because
Hmm.
it's very abstract. But
Hmm.
what Will Durant does is he takes us through this journey of philosophy. He makes it in a very narrative way so that it
Hmm.
doesn't remain boring, abstract stuff. He talks about their personal lives. He'll talk
Hmm.
about how it's related to broader history.
Hmm.
And through that kind of story, it's a narrative.
Hmm.
And so he's telling a story about how different people have thought in different contexts. And I remember a moment when I was reading this book for the first time. In fact, I had it at Jodhpur when I was studying in my first year. I remember still my friend borrowed it and he's written the name on it. And and when I read it for the first time, I remember feeling a sense of comfort when I realized that the questions that I have, if other people are asking the same questions, if I have some answers and other people are also thinking the same way, that means I'm thinking correctly, maybe, right?
Maybe.
And and that's something that I think is very helpful. It also helps you understand, I think, specific subjects much better. So when I teach law of torts here, for instance, um, students are often kind of curious about law says one thing, why is the judgment being given in a different way? And I have to tell them about philosophy. I have to tell them about public policy. I tell them, it depends on judges' perspective. It kind of also reflects on how that society is organizing itself.
Hmm.
To what extent do we want to recognize it? So in all these contexts, I think philosophy can be a great starting point. As I said, it gives you that meta perspective. Now, when you read Western philosophy, there are things it have the tendency to become a bit disconnected from our experiences, right? And that's the conversation that's happening in India. Why are we only focusing on, let's say, Eurocentric models? Why should we only look at Europe and the US for all insights and advice? Can we not find equally profound and helpful insights based on experiences that are rooted in this soil? And that's where I think um, I would suggest Indian philosophy. I mean, it's something, we are all humans, and humans have thought about these questions. And Indian philosophy, what Sarvapalli Radhakrishnan does uh, is he takes again us through the journey of these thinkers, starting from, pre-Vedic thinkers to the Vedas and Upanishads, then the Shadadarshana system in Indian philosophy. And then you start to understand the beauty, that there's so much variety. There are so many perspectives. It doesn't give you one single answer. And that's true about law as well, isn't it? I mean, you will never be able to find, let's say, one perfect answer for everything. You have your perspective, I have my perspective, you have your reasons, I have my reasons. And what philosophy again does, it helps you become open-minded. Like you realize that it's all right, I have my perspective, but I respect someone else's perspective as well, as long as it's a reasoned perspective. And when you bring that in law and you start to realize that, it's all right if there are disagreements, there are different perspectives. That's something that, again, enriches our social life. If all of us thought in a similar way, that would make all of us very boring.
Boring.
The idea that, there are different perspectives, but we can question our assumptions, we can keep on thinking better. All of this is essentially what a lawyer does, questioning of assumptions, right? Thinking about things in different perspectives. So this kind of, this gaining of perspectives through both Western philosophy and Indian philosophy, you start to appreciate these different perspectives, you become open-minded. You also start to see the connections between thinkers from, let's say, antiquity to the problems that we're facing today, right? When you think about indigenous perspectives now, I think unless you understand Indian philosophy, you'll never be able to offer any original perspective. To, we can all argue that we should remove the colonial vestige from our system. Let's reform, let's say, our criminal system. But what do we bring instead? Right? What's the alternative? And for that, unless you have a solid philosophical understanding of what this value system means, you'll not be able to come up with any concrete solutions.
Totally
And
agree.
I think it's in this senses that I would always recommend philosophy as the starting point. It may be a bit heavy at the beginning, but if you persist and if you go through authors which are very accessible like this, I think it can be a wonderful starting point for any inquiry.
I also think, Chinmay, at times, because yeah, these are books which were written and which cover our history. I often think that how about bringing around new philosophies?
Absolutely. Why not? Yeah,
What would be a better place than the classrooms where
absolutely. In fact,
minds are sitting, and
absolutely. And you'd be surprised. I'm often, as a teaching is a wrong word for this profession. It's kind of co-learning. It's
yes,
a
it's
co-learning exercise. And just yesterday, for instance, I remember in one of the TOTS classes, one of the students suggested, he said, Professor, why don't we look at, there was this very particular tort law doctrinal dispute that we were talking about. And he said, why can't we look at it from this perspective and think about duty of, essentially it was about contributory negligence. And he said, let's start with 50-50% assumption and then deviate based on what public policy considerations are. And I said, wow, I mean, that's an interesting perspective of looking at it. That's a new, let's say, insight. And that's based on his understanding of the broader situation. So we keep on learning. And I think classroom are one of the spaces where, this activity is celebrated. It's welcome.
True, true. So talking about history, that is also one subject I remember I was very interested in, and that's how I landed up in law. And when I went to law school, I was very happy that I was being taught history again. But then, they changed the meaning of history itself in law school. I remember pushed us to think and criticize history from the perspective of what it is written, think about the alternative history which would be there. So amongst your book was, two books which again were a part of my learning. It was by Mr. Ramchandra Guha, India After Gandhi, and then Discovery of India, the very famous book which also became a series, if I remember when I was, a kid, when I was in school.
Yeah,
I
yeah. Bharat Ek Khoj.
exactly Bharat Ek Khoj.
That's
So
also a wonderful, wonderful TV series.
yes, it gave a very totally different insights, both of them. And India after Gandhi was something where Ramchandra Guha literally challenged things. That,
Yeah,
how could it possibly be, and what could it possibly be? And
yeah, yeah.
they were not just assumptions; he also supported it with a lot of evidences also. So
Absolutely.
my question is, how can these books provide historical context and insights that are crucial for understanding
Yeah.
of India and society to a law student and also someone who's thinking about law?
Right, right. Again, I would preface this answer with again a qualifier or maybe a suggestion that again these are based on my experiences and my likings. What I would encourage you to is to read history and different perspectives on history, um, and then formulate your own understanding in a holistic way. Right. So these are not necessarily the only books, but you can explore your own understanding, explore different perspectives. Right, like we just saw in philosophy. More
Hmm.
perspectives, the better.
Hmm.
But I've personally enjoyed thoroughly Guha's, India after Gandhi and Nehru's discovery of India. As you pointed out, even during the pandemic, I started watching Bharat Ek Khoj, and
Oh,
what a treasure! I mean, that helped me kind of survive through pandemic so much because it gives you an understanding. Now, there are obvious reasons why a law student should read history because as Will Durant had famously said, there is what is present, but past unrolled. Essentially, there is no present moment that does not have a historical context. It's not just about laws, but it's about every conversation, every perspective, every insight, every face has, my face is based on my genetic history. So every moment has its history, and particularly when it comes to the understanding of norms, morality, values, and law, your history has shaped all of these concepts. And for me, when I really explored, and Guha, what he does is, again, he's very accessible, right? Typically, history is presented in a very chronological order as a date of events and people. That's not history for me. I feel, that's just data. For me, history is something that kind of, that's a story. It's something that can tell me about this journey. So I always look at history as exploring the journey, and this is the journey of our nation. And what he does is he's exploring these different strands, different values, different perspectives that played a role in our journey. And it's so relevant for our understanding of laws. I mean, think about constitutional law. Now, unless you understand, uh, let's say, what happened during the emergency era, you'll not be able to appreciate what happened in Kesavananda Bharti's case. Or you will not be able to appreciate, let's say, ADM Jabalpur
like
case,
a very right linkage. Yeah.
right? Or SR Bommai's case, right? All of these cases, they have political context. That politics is based on our understanding of history. So unless you know the context, you will not be able to appreciate, again, what exactly happened during that era and what exactly are the legal issues that led to perhaps these cases.
Yeah.
So both these books, and I would also recommend world history. Now again, it can be a bit overwhelming, but
Mhm.
I'm right now reading Durant's other book, which is called The Story of Civilization. It's a multi-volume book. I wouldn't recommend that for a law aspirant. But there's another book by Nehru. It's in the form of letters that he wrote to Indira Gandhi when she was
Indira
young.
Gandhi. That
Glimpses of
formed a
world
part
history.
of our CBSE syllabus, I remember. Mhm.
So glimpses of world history again. So it gives you an idea of how different civilizations have come and gone, what are their value systems, and where do we stand in the story of humanity.
Mhm.
Again, you start to see patterns that are emerging out of the world, right? History is all about recognition of those patterns. As I believe it was Santayana who said, those who don't read history are doomed to repeat history.
Wow. Yeah.
If we don't, history is like experiences, they're collective human experiences. If we fail to learn from our experiences, we'll commit the same mistakes over and over again.
Mhm.
And that's history. So when we read and learn and gain insights from those experiences, we can avoid certain mistakes, we can repeat certain good practices from this history. And we can also understand the present much better because you start to see general patterns which are coming out of history.
Yeah.
So the
Yeah.
same situation existed in, let's say, 1930s that existed in 1980s in somewhere else, or perhaps something that existed in Sumeria 3000 years ago is something that exists in the Roman Empire and something that exists in the contemporary US. And you start to see that pattern, and it also helps you understand how societies go through these cycles, and it helps you contextualize the debates that we have in a present way. So I think history is more like memory. Imagine a person without any memory. We would be completely clueless. If I
Clueless.
didn't know my past, if I didn't know who I am, where I come from, what made me who I am today, I would be a robot. So without understanding history, a civilization will become robotic. A community will lose its sense of identity. And it's for that purpose. And for lawyers, I think we don't need to overemphasize. I mean, be it Constituent Assembly debates and the discourses that happened there, it will give you a sense of how history becomes so important. When you read Constituent Assembly debates and you start to understand how different perspectives were explored and how different historical understandings played a role, I think it becomes just obvious to have a sense of what not only Indian history is, but also a sense of global history.
True, true. In fact, I would say go further, and I would say that students specifically who are reading common law, they should go to
Yes,
they should go to Magna Carta and understand that how that document was created, how the king was made to sign it. That's that's
absolutely.
that's so
And
important.
I'm glad that, in fact, you pointed out, one of the suggestions that I have later on is about, what Indian students typically do not do, law students and law aspirants, is they don't understand how important it is to understand the English legal history for India. Because our system right now, once we perhaps think about, some changes and modifications, it's a different thing. But today, the matter of fact is, our legal system is based on common law system, as you pointed out. If you don't understand how common law evolved, how common law operates, how common law is distinct from civil law systems, you will not be able to understand Indian legal system,
Not at all. Not at all.
right? And it's based on your understanding of English legal history, and how kind of English judiciary evolved. And for understanding English history, you'll have to understand French history, right?
Interesting.
So it has this kind of connection, which
You
then
have to
gives you that
connect all
aha
those.
moment, and you
Yeah.
realize that all of this is based on this context, and then you're able to utilize it much better.
That is when they realize that, why connecting these dots are important and
Yeah,
how can you understand, or it helps you to understand basically that why written words in law are so important and why do we keep on saying that interpretation, why
absolutely,
they have,
absolutely.
when did the system start is where we
Yeah,
should.
yeah. I mean, if anyone starts to ask a question, why do we think so highly of the Supreme Court? Right? We've taken it for granted. Anytime a Supreme Court judgment comes, we accept it. It's legitimate. But if we start thinking about why are we having this particular institution,
Correct.
and then you will start kind of investigating into history. Why is it that India focuses more on judicial interpretation?
Mm.
What is its relation to common law? How common law evolved in the English context? How is it related to English history? Right. And then kind of it all starts, I think, making sense. So,
That's
that makes it
very
absolutely essential.
important. History is very important. Great. So moving on to the next, chain of questions. I also saw my favorite book, and it was recommended to me by one of my favorite professors. The author was Granville Houston, and the book is Working a Democratic Constitution.
Yeah. Yeah.
This was one of those books where even I was told that Glanville Austin was a big fan of Indian Constitution, and he
Yeah.
used to argue with many jurists where they used to say that the Pakistani Constitution is better because it's more
Mhm.
close to the American way of things.
Right.
So
Right. Right.
there was
Right.
a huge debate, and this guy used to tell that whatever would happen, Indian constitution would never collapse the way it has
Mm.
been created.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things which he has, specifically described in this book. Now, I was very happy to see this inclusion in your list, and I'll be very happy if students start reading this book straight
Yeah.
away if they are preparing for law. So, I want you to just
Yeah.
elucidate that how does this book help law students grasp the intricacies of, the Indian constitutional framework, the nitty-gritties once they
Yeah.
are into school and once the classes started, they may, understand it, but at
Yeah.
least framework. So I often ask students also this question, that what is the difference between the word constitution and constitutional law? So
Mm,
first you
mm.
understand the constitution and
Yeah,
then you go inside and
yeah,
understand.
yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Dipu, how important this book is. Recently, there was a case in Bombay High Court
Uh-huh.
where uh, some incident happened where a senior lawyer blamed his junior lawyer for not appearing in a case.
Uh-huh.
Now, as a punishment, High Court did not like that, Mumbai High Court. Now, as a punishment, the lawyer apologized to the High Court. As a punishment, the judge said, gift your junior lawyer a copy of Austin's book.
Wow, okay.
That's and it's a classic. It's a classic. It's like as good as reading the Constitution in itself, because it's so authoritative and it's so lucid in its exposition. There are two parts, I would say, to this story. So the first one, where Glanville Austin wrote about the Indian Constitution and this story leading to the Constitution.
Yeah.
Again, he takes a historical approach, so I can classify this as a book of history as well, not essentially only about
Yes,
constitutional
absolutely.
law.
Yeah.
And he takes a very broader perspective. It's not a legal perspective alone. He talks about social aspect, political aspect, economic aspect. And in the first one, he talks about uh, what led to this. And he says it's social revolution, right? It's not simply about the law, but he focuses on three principles that our constitution, or let's say three goals that it tried to achieve: democracy, and kind of social revolution, and the idea of, let's say, equality. And in the first one, he talks about how that social revolution happened and what is the story and the Constituent Assembly debates, the antecedents of our constitutions, the 1935 Act and the story before that, how political parties played a role in all of this. And then what are the key components of our constitution? So Dr. Ambedkar famously called, for instance, part 3 of the constitution as the soul of the constitution,
Sure.
right? The fundamental rights. And he takes us through that journey. How did that kind of achieve the significance and the role that it has right now? Um, so when you read the Constitution, uh, all the gaps in the Constitution, the text of the Constitution, if you want to understand the, let's say, the memory of the Constitution, Glanville Austin will help you understand the story behind it.
Yes.
And it's such a nicely and very well organized story. And in the second part, working a democratic constitution. And we are used to thinking that constitution is something, once you have it, it will be followed. But that's not the case. As again, Ambedkar himself said, it's not about the text of the law, it's about the people who are going to work that constitution, who are going to implement that constitution, interpret that constitution. Any constitution, and even Aristotle, by the way, 2500 years back, he also compared multiple constitutions in Greece. And he said the same thing. He said, it's not about the constitution alone, it's about who are the people who are using that constitution. And that's, I think, that could be considered as the crux of Austin's entire perspective. What he's doing here, he says, yes, we have that constitution. How has it been interpreted? So, in working a democratic constitution, he tells us how people have interpreted it in India, different institutions, the tussle between judiciary and parliament, let's say, right? Because who is supposed to be the supreme authority? Who has the final say in interpreting the constitution? Why did they reach the decisions that they reached? What was the political context in it, right? So many, as you rightly pointed out, many scholars, even Churchill had predicted that, Indians are not able to govern themselves. We are not capable of governing ourselves. So our constitution is going to fail and will not kind of, we will eventually turn into a banana republic. But that didn't happen because we had people with integrity, right? We had people who could have a conversation about how constitution could be interpreted. And there were differences, there were disagreements, but we all agreed to kind of work it out through this framework that our founding fathers gave us. And so it's a very nice story of how these people also interpreted, applied, and lived this constitution, right? So it's a story of the life of our constitution, told through this lens of history and politics and perhaps even philosophy. And that's what makes it a classic. So if you read, ideally, if you read any provision of the Constitution, if you read the history of that and the context of that, you will have such a thorough understanding of, all different provisions, important provisions of the Constitution, that once you understand the story, no one can take it away. You'll not forget it. It's not about memorizing, it's about understanding. And if you understand that story, you've understood it for life. And I
Very true.
think Williams does that so beautifully and so articulately.
The way he writes is something through which, he has made his ideas much clearer than anyone else on Indian Constitution.
Exactly. I think that clarity is what makes this book stand apart from, other. I mean, there are so many books that are written about constitutional law, history of constitution. But I think that the lucidity, the organization, and just the clarity of thought, I think that makes this book stand apart. And that's why Bombay High Court also recommended this
True.
as a gift.
So I would want also the audience to know one thing, that they can also ask us question using the chat option. So if you have any questions relating to the books that we are recommending, since this is a purely an academic exercise, we do expect questions to be expect questions to be of academic nature. Okay, so if you have any questions, do use the chat room. We'll take up the questions which we think are are worth discussing in this forum. Okay, moving on further, we go to one subject which sounds very, very boring. And as a law student also, I remember when these lectures started, there were many seniors who told me that it will be very boring for you, blah, blah, blah. But then I remember the faculty came in and they said that this is what is called as jurisprudence, which means of law, and since by that time I had, though I was not a science student, I started having this great affinity towards science. I thought that it is also important that we should understand that how, law was involved. What is the science behind it? So there were some new books, as I have not heard about them. But then if you recommended, I would want to hear it from you, that how would it help them, to
Yeah,
understand. Books
yeah.
are Rethinking Indian Jurisprudence by Akash Singh Rathore and Garima Goswami. Jurisprudence, the Philosophy and Method of Law by Edgar von Heimel. Legal Traditions of the World by Patrick Glenn. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, first of all, let's acknowledge that jurisprudence can be a very dull and rare and abstract subject.
Yeah.
The point is, let's keep that all aside for a moment,
Yes.
right? Let's keep all of that aside for a moment. Now, let's again go back to the first question, the basic question. Why are our laws the way they are? Let's start with this simple question. Or let's say when we find something offensive, when we find something immoral, why do we think it's immoral? Right? If we start with this fundamental question, and if we keep all the the kind of pedantic philosophical aspects aside, or let's say this obscure ideas aside, I think this can give you all the uh, starting point that you need to think when it comes to jurisprudence. Jurisprudence is not doing anything else rather apart from asking this fundamental question: why are the things the way they are? Why is our law the way it is? It could have been completely different, right? We could have had, for instance, in Game of Thrones, they resolve their disputes through these sword fights, right? Or some sort of trial. Why don't we have such trials today? It sounds fun. We should have such trials. But why do we do it in such boring way where two people are arguing and they're pointing about different aspects of their cases? Have we ever wondered, right? Why is it that we are following a particular system? What makes this system perhaps better? Or is it possible to improve this system? Maybe there are deficiencies in the system that we haven't realized, and we can improve the system. Jurisprudence is doing nothing but asking these basic questions, right? It's asking about fundamental questions of why is it that our legal system, our legal values, our laws, the way they are, when they could have been otherwise, right? Historically, there have been something different. Historically, for instance, if you were in 11th century Baghdad, your laws would be very different. What
And
makes today's law different from that law? There must be certain principles that are different. What are these principles that it is based on? I think all of this kind of again takes us back to that fundamental question. Now, uh, again, just as we suggested in philosophy, you have Western perspective, you have Indian perspective. Although I don't want to overemphasize this distinction also. It's not as watertight.
understandable. Yeah.
There have always been interactions and exchanges. But broadly, I think the idea of jurisprudence in India is not taught in a way that needs to be taught. It has to be taught through our experiences. And that's what I think Akash Singh Rathod and Garima Chaudhary do. what they do is they think about this question: why do Indian law students find jurisprudence so difficult or so kind of detached? And they say it's because we are not taught about it that is connected to our experiences. So what they do is they take certain examples, all right? They take certain examples and case studies. For instance, the case of free speech and all India issue that happened recently, then equality and reservation, or the issue of LGBTQ and law, right? We've had multiple judgments in recent years, or ethics of organ donation, or the issue of, rape and security from a Buddhist vantage point. So there are
Yes.
such interesting perspectives that are connected to what has happened in Indian cases recently. Uh,
Mhm.
what is moral? What is immoral? How do we decide on boundaries? What is the idea of liberty? Is Indian society as focused on individual identity, or are we focused more on our relationship with the broader community? What would it mean for our understanding? Or the idea of, India is always, there are very interesting perspectives, but some scholars have said that the idea of gender plurality is something that has existed in multiple regions in India from time immemorial. And we weren't really kind of making this binary distinction. So when we had that system, why did we do away with it? Uh, and why does Supreme Court need to kind of rule on it again today? So what this book does is it gives Indian examples, Indian cases, through which you could understand these philosophical debates, right? Jurisprudential debates. And I think that's what makes it more interesting. And that's why we've included it here. Uh, so, for instance, if I may just point out some of the chapters and how interesting they are. So, the Dharma Shastra to modern Hindu law, we currently have again a debate between decolonization. But when we think about doing away, what kind of systems we want to have, right? What kind of systems can we fall back on? And what are the perspectives on it? Or Gandhi's affirmation of law or Ambedkarite jurisprudence. I think these are very concrete examples which talk about specific perspectives that all law students can relate to, because these are debates that we keep on having in our everyday life. And that makes jurisprudence very interesting. These abstract questions can become more specific uh, and more relatable. And 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 apart from that, then you have jurisprudence books that gives you an idea of global jurisprudence. So you must have heard about, I mean, of course, all of us have heard about the Me Too movement, right? How it changed our understanding of law, or the recent Depp versus Heard trial about defamation. All of it, again, relates to certain fundamental questions, certain jurisprudential questions. So some of these books will help you situate these specific cases in the broader understanding. So you don't have to kind of, go into the complex aspects of jurisprudence, but starting with some of the relatable issues and topics can be a great starting point. And I think that's why I've included these books in the list.
I feel like buying them now. So they were very new to me, but yeah, yeah, there are different perspectives which are always something which interest you a lot. And yeah, so moving away from books, there is one question by attendee which I would want to ask you, and what it is, what do you love most about the law, and why did you want to get into it? Yeah.
Interesting, very interesting. As I said, this list is influenced by aspects of law that I enjoy. I think uh, for me, and I've said it often, uh, BITS, for instance, is not just the school of law. It's more than that. It's also school of justice.
Mhm.
So ideally, it should be, all law schools in India, everywhere, should be renamed as schools of law and justice. It's that justice aspect that attracts me to this field,
But Professor
right?
Madhavan used to say that every law school should be named as School of Justice also. You're right.
Right. And I think that's what attracted me to this field, because uh, it has such uh, wisdom in it, right? It's trying to figure out what's fair, what's reasonable, what's wise for all humans to do. It deals with every aspect of life, right? It deals with standards of food safety from to constitutional law issues. So it deals with each and every aspect of life. And in everything, what it is trying to say is, let's be reasonable, right? Let's be reasonable. Let's be fair in our understanding. And I think that fairness is something that attracted me to this field. And particularly that's why I think, I was always inclined uh, to philosophical aspects of law. But also I see it even when I teach, for instance, private law issues, law of torts. Again, what it is asking is this fundamental. Law of torts has this one request for the society. It says, let's be reasonable in our behavior with everyone else. If you are unreasonable, then you must pay the cost of your negligence. You must pay the cost of your unreasonableness. Uh,
True.
and so that reasonableness is something I think I find very, very attractive and wise for a community to follow.
Great. So there is a question on case laws and case studies also, which is covered in some of the books which you have recommended.
Yes. Yes.
So I'll move on to that question where you have recommended landmarks in the law by
Yeah.
Lord. Okay, before I move on to all the attendees, we'll be sending you this list by Professor Chinmay via mail. So all of you
Yeah.
are going to, so don't worry. Okay, so don't try to jot it down when I'm saying. So relax, you just attend it and hear it. Okay, so the books which Professor Chinmay has recommended for landmark case laws are Landmarks in Law by Lord Denning, and one of again a book which I also love. It's 10 Judgments That Change India by Zia Modi.
Yeah.
So please explain that, how can these landmark judgments
Yeah.
influence also, push the legal thought into the
Yeah.
students.
Yeah. So as you pointed out, Deepu, and that's why we have Lord Denning also. Uh, Common law system is what we follow in India. Now, what does common law system mean is that we rely on judicial pronouncements equally to statutes. So, unlike civil law systems, so continental Europe, for instance, France, Germany, they have what we call a civil law system where their statutes matter more than what court says. What the law says is actually more authoritative, and what professors interpret is actually what is more authoritative. Under the common law systems, it's basically judicial pronouncements that are more authoritative. That's how it evolved, right? When we were talking about history, what
Mhm.
happened was one of the kings, one of the Norman kings, it sent its judicial officers to various counties, various places in England. They would have common judgments. And that's why judgments have more authority in India than in continental or civil law systems. Given that fact, it becomes imperative for a law student. In every subject, you'll find that there are these authoritative landmark judgments. So if for instance, you're studying tort law, you cannot study tort law if you don't know Donoghue versus Stevenson and the ginger beer case, right? Because with that judgment, law changed, right? Because it gives new direction and new shape and even new substance to law. So landmark cases in law in India, given that we are a common law system, they're absolutely essential. Now, what Zia Modi does is she's focusing on public law more than private law generally, but she's pointing out the story of how Indian legal system, it's kind of connected to a few earlier books that we examined. So be it Granville Austin's Working a Democratic Constitution, or the history aspect of it by Ramchandra Guha. You'll find common elements in all these books because ultimately they're talking about the story of India, the story of the legal system. But Zia Modi does it through the lens of courts and their judgments. And she's kind of invoking that narrative, uh, weaving that narrative through some very fascinating cases. So, we talked about Kesavananda Bharti's case, and that case gave us the doctrine, which even today is a matter of discussion and debate as authoritative. I mean, there is no law that says India needs to have, or our constitution has a basic structure. So the basic debate was between, yes, parliament can amend the constitution, but can it completely change the constitution? That was the fundamental question that was asked. And there the court said, no, you cannot change certain aspects of it, which are basic structure of the constitution. Is it said anywhere in the constitution? No. It's a judicial pronouncement. But that judicial pronouncement has become the law of the land because we are a common law system. So that's why reading these cases is absolutely essential. And it gives you that, again, perspective which merely reading the text of the law may not offer. So very interestingly, for instance, where does this basic structure doctrine come from? There was one German professor who gave a lecture at BHU, which
Yeah.
was heard by a student of one of the judges, who then talked to this judge, and that's how the judge had the idea to read and incorporate this basic structure debate. If you only read the judgment, you'll not be able to understand this story, these interesting nuances. Or, for instance, how Fali Nariman regretted his arguments in Advocates on Record case. He was very uh, sad about how things unfolded. Even though while he was arguing, he argued it with all his passion and zeal. But in hindsight, he says, I wouldn't have argued that case the same way. So only reading the text of that case may not give you those insights. But what Zia Modi does is she kind of investigates the background, the people who are involved, the story, and will highlight some of these landmark public law cases broadly. And I think again, it just kind of embeds these ideas in your head so well that you don't need to memorize it, right? So even if you're reading constitutional law, you'll not be able to, there are 50 cases that you study or 100 cases that you study over the semester, and it's very difficult to memorize the facts of it. What helps is understanding, not memorizing. And I think it's through books like this that you can understand a case law,
True.
understand its history, understand its significance. Once you understand it, no one can take away that understanding from you, not even time, because it's now part of your
Part of
who you are.
your understanding.
Yeah. So I think, that's what these books do. Now, what Lord Denning does, I don't have that copy here, unfortunately, but Lord Denning is, what I refer as one of those maverick judges, iconoclasts. Some judges are more heroic. I don't know if there's a better word than other judges. Although, we need to have that balance between those who are going ahead of the law and those who are sticking to the law. But Denning was someone who said, it's all right, I respect judicial precedents, but I am going to go ahead and give my own opinion on this. So he widened the boundary of the law. And that's why he was considered as an iconoclast, someone who understood the tradition, but did not always respect the tradition. So something similar to, for instance, Krishna Iyer or Justice Bhagwati in
I was
India.
about to take that name. Yeah.
So he's one of those judges who kind of expanded the boundaries of the law, who said that, law is not about technicalities, it's about justice. And if I need to go beyond the technicalities to do justice in particular cases, I will do that. I don't care what judicial precedent says. So he's one of those judges, and that's why I love him. And that's why, one of the books by him I've included in the list, where he talks about his own experiences as a judge. He also appreciates that, there are conservative judges. In fact, we'll come to that book later on about Scalia. But he talks about what it is like to be a judge. What are the factors that judges take into account? How they also have this sense of, doubt in them, even as they're giving the final judgments, and how these different judgments have shaped the society. So I think it's a very great insight. I'm sure many students here and aspirants would also be interested in pursuing this path of judiciary. So
Yeah.
to get insight into that someone else's mind, a judge as as profound as Lord Denning, is just an amazing perspective.
Excellent. So now we were talking about all those things. We also need to talk about challenges, because that's why we need more and more great lawyers.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
the country is waiting for the next Ram Jethmalani, the next Harish Salve, and yeah, we can play a part in creating those. And so these students who are preparing, as well as those who are right now in law schools, also need to be aware about those judgments. So the question related to those challenges in legal systems, and the books which you had recommended had these few in form of Fali S. Nariman's Indian Legal System, Can It Be? Excellent book. And then Court and Their Judgments by Arun Shore.
Yeah.
So I want you to speak on these two books and how a student who's making up his mind or is already into a law school can read these and have that, they can gain from it, and they can probably contribute to, to the challenges that we are facing nowadays.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, one of the reasons why I think BITS Law School is established is to help address these challenges, right? there are problems. I mean, we all know that our legal system can work a lot better. There are fundamental problems related to pendency of cases, right? It's become somewhat of a common knowledge that if you go to a court of law, it's not the law that people fear, but it's the very process that becomes punishment. So what Fali Nariman does, and he has extensive experience, he's still active. He still is out on and about giving his perspectives.
Yes.
So who better than giving an insight into what are the things that we are good at, we are bad at, and what are the things that we need to change? A man who has lived through that journey of Indian legal system. And I think Fali Nariman is one of those kind of legends who has seen each and every aspect throughout his life. He started his practice in Mumbai, went to Delhi, went into arbitration. So he has this range of perspective. So when Fali Nariman talks about flaws in our legal system, challenges to our legal system, we have to listen. And I think what he's done in that book is he goes theme wise. He talks about different challenges. So challenge of pendency of cases, for instance. And it's a very well argued, statistically very solid book, because every claim that he's making is supported by evidence, is supported by data, and offers a very clear and accessible guidelines as to how things can be improved. So, for instance, when it comes to, he also will trace the history of Indian legal system. And some of the problems are related to the very idea that we are not able to kind of understand what what we should retain from history and what we should let go from history, right? So Bombay High Court, for instance, again, students don't realize it, but three high courts in India are very distinct from other high courts, which
Yeah.
are colonial high courts per se: Bombay, Madras, and Calcutta High Court. Uh, Now he talks about how these high courts came into being, how even after independence, some of the practices that we are following are also not suited to our context, how things can be changed. Some of the aspects were also better actually in these colonial courts that we need to maybe bring back. It's not only always a black and white situation where
True,
things were
true,
bad
true.
and now they need to be improved. So he has that perspective because he's seen both worlds. So he knows what are the things that worked better earlier, what are the things that could be improved, what are the things that did not work earlier. And in talking about these challenges, he talks about again the distinction between who has the supremacy, whether it should be the parliament, whether it should be the legislature. He also talks about selection process of judges. And again, one of the points, as I said, of having these law schools is to contribute to this legal system, right? And if we want to contribute to the legal system, we want to first understand what it is that we can improve, where can we contribute. If we want to contribute, what perspective we need to have. So
Mhm.
if we want to become judges, if we want to become better lawyers, I think we have to heed the advice of Fali Nariman about the selection process of judges, about how lawyers can improve in their understanding, how tribunals can be better generally, right? As obscure a thing as river tribunal, right? And how that has affected the notion of federalism in India, where two states have problems regarding water sharing, how even that can be improved. So
Mhm.
it's very insightful, it's very robust in its suggestions, and helps you understand some of the sadder aspects of our legal practice and prepares you for the legal world that you will enter into. So you're not too surprised when you enter into this world. You already know what are the challenges that you may face.
So yeah, now we are almost at the end of the session, but before that, there are two very important core areas of law,
Yeah,
which is social skills and soft skills, and academic writing and research.
yeah,
You have given a very exhaustive list about,
yeah,
are those books which a student should be mentally prepared, should be read, and should have a great idea about, which includes again by Glanville Austin, Learning the Law, Soft Skills for Effective Lawyering by Randall Killer.
yeah.
Now, for academic writing, also you have, there's a very exhaustive list
Yeah.
which, so we can just quickly just go through those,
Yeah, sure, sure, sure. So just before that, I'd suggest that you browse through autobiographies also of all these
Yeah,
people that we were
I
discussing.
had saved that question for the last. That's
Okay,
how.
we'll come back to it. Now,
Yeah.
one of the things I think law students need to understand, and even aspirants need to understand, is that law is a discipline that focuses so much on your writing and your writing well. right? Because you are going to be submitting so many memorials. You're going to be submitting so many plans. Your kind of written submissions play a very huge role, be it your legal practice oriented writing or be it your academic writing. You need to be really good at it. And I think our law schools need to improve on that forum, that kind of area. So there's one book that I absolutely recommend. It's Academic Legal Writing by Eugene Wollock. Now it talks about how do you write for law review articles. Scholarship in India is not really at par with, let's say, global scholarship when it comes to giving interesting insights, giving it in an organized, clear, lucid, and a robust way. So this gives you a structure as to how do you write your essays, how do you write your journal articles. So a law student can greatly benefit from it. This is another classic, Learning the Law by Glanville Williams. Uh, how do you start your law school journey? Right? Where do you get your sources from? What are the primary sources? What are the secondary sources? Uh, what is what is good research practice? When you borrow from someone else, how do you kind of credit them for their ideas, right? So referencing, avoiding plagiarism. Some of these skills are very basic. And again, one last book in that is The Craft of Research, an excellent book which starting from your very fundamental formulation of question to your conclusion. How do you organize your research paper, right? That's, I think, Indian law students generally can improve uh, in this area. And I think if they want to, if they're committed to it, these books can be really great. But that's not the end of the story. I think there are soft skills that we need to understand. Any lawyer and a law student realizes that it's more about how you understand people, right? As the saying goes, a good lawyer knows the law, but a great lawyer knows the judge. So this book, Soft Skills for Effective Lawyer, what it does is it tells you don't be purely academic in your understanding. You have to know how to talk to people. You have to know how to work in a team. You have to know how to kind of, if you are in a leadership position, what are some of the skills that you require? So all of these soft skills that nobody teaches you really, right? There's no course that teaches you about working well in a team, but you need to have that. So I think these books can be really great in that context.
Just when I remember that, there was a discussion where students were asking me inspirations from web series, and I told them you have to be a mix of Harvey Specter and also Saul Goodman. So you need not be very academic, but then you should use the skills which Saul Goodman used to,
That's a great perspective.
Okay, and coming to the final question, there are two things which are very, very important because, yeah, inspiration is what students want.
Yeah.
They get inspired not just by web series, but also they need real perspectives.
Yeah.
There are two things through which they can get it via books. One is autobiographies and biographies. The other is, but of course, fictional and those legal narratives which are there.
Yeah.
There are so many great authors who have written these things. Sadly, none of them are Indian, but I could see one of those authors here quoted by you, Vijay Tendulkar, where he has written "Silence, the court is in session."
Yeah.
So please just give an idea to our students of biographies, autobiographies, and also the fiction and legal narrative.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. What we're looking for is, I think, inspiration. And I think the fundamental point there is about empathy, right? We are much more motivated when we are able to kind of understand someone else's journey, someone else's perspective. There's a great book called Inventing Human Rights by Lean Hunt. And she says, how human rights came to be is because during 19th century, there were a lot of novels written. And those novels were written from first person perspective. And as people started to understand someone else's life from that perspective, they started to appreciate that all of us have the same internal life. Our minds are the same. So why are we treating people differently if all of us are facing the same problems? And I think that's what reading fiction and autobiographies does. It kind of allows you to empathize, it allows you to understand and go into someone else's mind. Now, there I have no dearth of suggestions. Some of the legends in the law, right? This person I'm absolutely a fan of, Fali Nariman. If you ever get a chance, there are some YouTube videos where when he talks about his journey, he talks about uh, his story and his suggestions, and I would definitely recommend that. But this is where he does it in a much more elaborate way, right? And you'll be able to understand not just Nariman's own story. It's a very fascinating story, starting with Burma, right, and ending in in this fascinating kind of twist and turn, and right now in Mumbai with arbitration. So it's a very fascinating, interesting story, and absolutely a treasure trove of experiences and wisdom. The second, perhaps not very well known, is MC Chagla. Now, he was one of the first permanent judges of the Bombay High Court. As I said, Bombay High Court had a very distinct reputation in Indian judiciary. And MC Chagla had even more reputation in Bombay High Court. So you can already imagine how reputable and dignified perhaps this judge was, and absolutely an inspiration for everyone. So again, his story is somewhere between pre-colonial and then post-independence time, colonial and post-independence time. So it also gives you a nice idea of how people kind of evolved and stories evolved from pre-independence to post-independence. And he also went on to serve. I mean, why we are studying these different books, because he also served as a diplomat. Nani Palkhiwala was also an expert in economics. In fact, his insights were sought for always, after every budget. He's the one, in fact, who also championed the cause of liberalization in India.
Yeah.
Lawyer, but doing all of it. So I think these are rightly called as courtroom geniuses, and perhaps iconoclasts and heroes. So this will give you a very nice idea. Nani Palkhiwala, MC Chagla, and Fali Nariman. But there are many other books. There's one by Indu Bahan called Legal Eagles that has stories of 7 lawyers. I think that's also a great resource. There's one American judge, I think, I'm fascinated by particularly, and he is Antonin Scalia. The conservative scholarship in India, philosophically conservative, it's not very robust, but especially when it comes to legal philosophy. So you can browse through Antonin Scalia and his perspective about what originalism means. He says, let's not be too activist in our stances. We need to respect the wisdom of the tradition. Sure. So Scalia is someone I would recommend if you are interested in understanding how you can still be someone who does things with integrity, but still you can hold on to traditions. So some of these are great autobiographies and biographies, and these books, these fictional works, I'm pretty sure many students here would be interested in reading, fictional works. So I have a couple of suggestions. One is The Trial by Franz Kafka. Another one, which pretty much all of us have heard about or perhaps even read, To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee. And finally, from a Maharashtrian author, Silence, the Court is in Session by Vijay Tendulkar. All of them deal with the theme of, tensions in law, inequality in law, experience of law, right? How does it feel to be part of that legal process? What are the problems and they do it in a very personal way, right? In a very subjective way. And I think that's what makes it very relatable and enjoyable. So if you're tired of reading philosophy or history, you can always go back and read these works and still get same insights, but perhaps in a more relatable way.
Excellent. So we are almost at the last leg. And before I close, there are some attendees also who have asked this question. What's your closing remarks to the students who want to pursue law or who are already pursuing law, apart from the books and everything that we have discussed as a professor at law? What are your say some advices to these students?
Keep an open mind, keep on exploring, be curious, right? You will never be able to get maybe one final answer. You don't have to read, in a very academic way, all of these books. Do it whenever you have time. I use audiobooks when I'm driving, not, or when I'm walking, for instance. Sometimes when I don't have anything else to do, I'll just quickly listen to 5 minutes of a podcast or an audiobook. So do it as you're engaged in other activities. Read 5 pages, 10 pages, maybe what you are interested in. Keep on learning, be curious about things, and gradually dots will connect. It's something that's become a cliche now, but I can, this is something all of us experience. Eventually the dots start connecting. The more open-minded you are, I think, the more willing you are to explore different perspectives, easier it is for you to connect the dots and have that kind of broader picture, well-rounded understanding of things. And as a law student, having that well-rounded perspective, that holistic perspective, can make you stand apart from other candidates who are simply focusing on, let's say, one interpretation and one text and one conviction. So that's perhaps my my only suggestion here. Be curious, be open-minded.
Thank you so much, Professor Chinmay, and thank you for taking out time. I know you had a very long day today. I saw
No,
you in
it's a
the
pleasure.
students, judging students. That's actually very emotionally consuming. Also. But then you took out time and you came and you discussed such an important facet of law graduation for students who are pursuing law, as well as those students who are planning to. So thanks a lot. Thanks a lot to all the students who attended this session. And I can I can just guess that what's your inclination to do law and your dedication towards, pursuing the same, why you attended and you were there till the end with us. Don't worry about the list. What we're going to do is we have also recorded this session, so we'll send a recording also, because the list will be a list, but the interpretation which Professor Chinmay gave you should also be there should with you. So we'll upload this on the YouTube and we'll share the link, as well as we'll share the list with you also, so that in case if you want to buy these books, you want to have a copy of your own, you can do the same also. Okay, and special thanks to my team members also who facilitated this session at the back end. And thank you so much. And good night and happy weekend to each one of you. Thank you.